This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome everybody to another edition of Squash Canada's Coach PD webinar series, and today's specific topic, Squash 57. Just hang tight for a moment as I change my screen here. Okay, so just a few things we'd like to go over before we pick up on this video that shows us a few more interesting things, and then we'll get into a nice questionnaire before we lead into our presenters today. So again, yeah, today's Squash Canada Coach PD webinar, a few ground rules before we get started. If everyone can ensure their webcams are off and microphones are muted throughout the entire presentation, we will ensure if you have questions, please type them into the chat box. You will see the chat box in your GoToMeeting. It looks like a little bubble, and any questions asked throughout the presentation, we will answer at the end during Q&A. What we would ask is anyone with a question to ensure that you have identified the presenter that will be speaking, you would like to respond to the question, so we ensure the proper person answers. The recording and the PowerPoint will be shared, so don't worry if you miss something. We will share it with you at the end of the presentation later today or tomorrow. So without further ado, we're going to pick up the video for another about 5 minutes, and then we have a questionnaire that we're going to ask, and I would ask everyone to start preparing by going to menti.com in advance of this questionnaire that we will ask you prior to starting.
It's very easy to pick up. We've got a really big bouncy ball, it's a big racket, and it makes the game great for people who maybe have never played racket sports before.
I started playing Squash 57 in uni. I found it had a really good social aspect to it, so it was an easy way to make friends in first year when no one knows anyone.
You can start from complete beginner and it's actually a very easy game to pick up. You're playing other people, so it's not like going to the gym where you're fighting yourself, but it's just really sociable and you have a giggle.
It's less severe on your joints, and because the ball's a little bouncier, it gives you an opportunity to play different levels and have a good game.
The kids were doing it, so I did it, so it was cross-generational. Get on court as a family.
Playing Squash 57 has added to my fitness and keep the rallies going a bit longer, gets me moving around the court. It definitely helps between squash and Squash 57.
It's a really social side that I always wanted to get into, and I remember my coach said you should play, it'll really help you squash, and it has done that, but more so it's just fun. You'll definitely catch the bug as soon as you start playing.
Join your local club and see if there are some group sessions, and there'll be a beginners group, and have a go.
Welcome back, everybody, from that great video. Just a friendly reminder: if everyone can mute their microphones, there's some extra sound in there. If everyone can mute their mics, please. So if everyone can go to menti.com, and as you'll see on the screen, we have a short survey that we'd like to ask of everybody. So menti.com using the code 55382135. Okay. And what's going to happen here in a moment is we're going to go to the first question, and you'll have about 30 seconds to 60 seconds to respond to each question. It's a simple yes or no. There's 5 questions, so it'll take us 4 or 5 minutes just to hammer through this really quickly. So here we go. So first question, revenues. Do you think most of squash facilities would benefit from a more diverse revenue stream? And as you can see here, we're populating the responses live as we talk. With 40 plus responses and 80 plus people, we still have about 40 people to reply. Just another 30 seconds or so to the voting, even though it says a minute. Any final responses to this this question? Okay, we're going to move to the next question. And I'll start the countdown. So this question, diversity. Would you like squash to be more inclusive, such as more women, individuals with a disability, etc.? Yes or no? Just another 30 seconds, still about 30 people to respond. Still see some more coming in. About 15 seconds. Any last responses from anybody? Okay, we're going to move to the next question. So juniors, do you believe that fun is one of the main factors that encourages juniors to play a safe sport, or to play sport in general even? About 30 more seconds to respond. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. Capacity. Do you think there are any squash courts that may be at risk of being closed or repurposed? About 15 seconds. Any final responses to this question? Great. Next question. Doubles. Do you think there are squash players who would play doubles if they had the opportunity? Just about 10 more seconds. Last chance for any responses to this question. Great. So that's the end of our questions. And I think based off the responses, as everyone can see, there's an overwhelming interest in trying to find something new and creative to help squash come back from this pandemic. And the feeling of our panel today is that Squash 57 just might be the answer to help your squash clubs try something new. And so with that being said, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our lead presenter today, Dave Morrish, who will introduce himself and his presenters. And I am going to just switch my screen to today's presentation. Welcome, Dave. And you may have to unmute Dave. Dave, can you hear us? There might be some technical difficulties with Dave. Would any of our other presenters, Patrick, Pete, Lolly, or Steve, would you like to take over for Dave while he sorts out his technical difficulties?
Yeah, well, I don't mind. I can do that.
All right. So introducing Patrick Osborne.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so Dave was going to introduce himself and then go through a list of people who will be presenting today. I'll let Dave introduce himself when he manages to sort out his technical challenges. So if we can skip to the next slide and just go through who is on the panel. We have Dave, who's on the left there, who's I guess a former coach and his to a couple of top world ranking players. He's a level 4 coach and he's coached worldwide in I think 3 different continents. So he's a very established coach. We have Pete Goodings, and he was one of the top UK Squash 57 players before he migrated to Canada. And I played with Pete in county competitions. He still plays squash, and he plays Squash 57 at a very high level. So he's very experienced in this game. And he's the head pro and squash manager at Glenora Club in Edmonton. Moving on, we have Lolly Gillen, and she may be a familiar face to many of you. She's a passionate doubles player and has over 50 doubles titles. She was president of Squash Canada for 5 years and is now the Secretary General of Pan American Squash Federation and is a recent addition to the WSF Squash 57 Commission. And then last but not least, we have Steve Wren. So Steve has played squash at a very high level and he's won the British Open. And he hasn't yet tried Squash 57, but he is very well aware of the potential of this sport and is very supportive of it. And you will see from the agenda, we've quite a bit to go through. So skip to the agenda slide, moving on to the agenda. So there's a lot of material to go through here. And I guess one of the reasons I said I would speak on behalf of Dave is I'm the first person to speak, so it saves a handover. But we're going to be going through what Squash 57 is, why we like Squash 57. We're going to look at the current state of squash within Canada and where we think we might be heading. So the potential behind Squash 57. And then we've got some pointers as to where you can get Squash 57 information and some closing remarks and a Q&A session at the end. So if we can move on to the next slide, which is where I was going to start off. So thank you, Dave. My name is Patrick Osborne, as I said earlier, and I'm the chair of the World Squash Federation, the Squash 57 Commission. So the WSF, this World Squash Federation, is the world body that oversees all disciplines of squash, including the softball and hardball games that you know, both singles and doubles formats, and Squash 57 as well, which again in singles and doubles formats. The Squash 57 Commission itself aims to protect the integrity and fairness of Squash 57 while raising the global awareness of the game. We focus on the rules, the equipment that we're using, so the equipment specifications, the coaching and officiating, while growing the inventory of our up-to-date online resources and a calendar of competitions. I would expect that prior to this webinar, you would have done a bit of homework and will know about Squash 57, at least to a minimal level. But just to err on the safe side, I'm going to quickly run through some slides that will ensure that we all have the same base level of understanding. So we can skip to the next slide. So this talks to the history of Squash 57. And as I'm saying, Squash 57 is a discipline of the game of squash. And the game of international softball squash, which I would imagine that we're all very familiar with, was born in 1830. And again, 80 years later, US Racketball began. So that's the sport that you'll also be probably familiar with. In 1976, so nearly 150 years after squash, a game called UK Racketball began. And this game became recognized by England squash nearly 20 years later when the first England nationals took place. In 2016, given the potential confusion for a global sport called racquetball with a CK, and I don't know if you can see my sweatshirt here, but CK in the name, it was rebranded by the WSF to Squash 57. And this webinar, with your support, will be the catalyst that will kickstart a Squash 57 explosion throughout Canada and will be an example for the rest of the world to see. We move, oh, perfect. So the court, both singles and doubles Squash 57 are played on the same regulation international squash singles courts. And I've seen in some of the chat going on the side of the screen here that that's been noticed. Squash 57 uses the exact same court markings, except that we don't use the service line on the front wall. So the faded line in the diagram is not used by Squash 57, but otherwise all the lines are the same. For the racket, if we move on to the next slide, we use the same racket as American racquetball, which can be no more than 22 inches in length. And that is 5 inches shorter than a squash racket. And you might be able to see behind my right-hand shoulder here, 2 rackets hanging up. And that will show you the difference between the racquetball racket that we use for Squash 57 and the squash racket. The more popular frames weigh between 150 and 180 grams. And the major brands that we see in the UK will be Caracal, Head, and Dunlop. If we move on to the next slide, this is quite a complicated slide, and it's talking to the Squash 57 ball. So the Squash 57 ball is 57 millimeters in diameter, and that's about 40% larger than the Squash 40 millimeter ball, which I have here in my hands. And is therefore about 2/3 heavier than the squash ball. All squash balls are known for their rebound resilience, i.e. how bouncy they are, and that is what this graphic is showing. It's showing the bounces of the balls. So the squash double yellow dot ball is about half as bouncy as the black Squash 57 ball. And the Squash 57 blue ball is about twice as bouncy as the squash single yellow dot ball. So that'll give you an idea of how bouncy these balls are. And for those of you who are familiar with American racquetball, the diagram also includes on the right-hand side an American racquetball. And you can see that is significantly even more bouncy than the Squash 57 balls. There are about 10 manufacturers of these balls, the Squash 57 balls, and they include Caracal, Price, Dunlop. The Squash 57 balls may vary in quality and bounce consistency, so I would recommend that players use balls that are approved by the WSF, so they've gone through the rigorous testing process that we have in place. If we can move on to the next slide, and this talks to the rules. The rules are multiple pages long, but here are some base differences that are worth noting. So for the serve is hit off the bounce. So it's not hit as a volley, it's hit off a drop onto the floor. And as I said, the service line on the front wall is not used. So if the first service is a fault, then the receiver has the choice to stop play and request a second serve, or to play the fault itself. In doubles, the players strike the ball alternately, and so there's a continuous rotation of ball striker, and you would have seen that in the videos at the start of this webinar, where the striker of the ball then rotates to the back of the court to enable the next 3 players to play the ball before they strike the ball again. Scoring for doubles and singles is the same as squash, with a point to rally, par 11, and if tied at 10-all, then a player will win by 2 points, and matches will be best of 5. If we move on to the last of my slides here. So squash 57 is a global sport and is played on squash courts. The WSF Squash 57 Commission will be promoting squash 57 wherever there is a squash court today, which means every country on this map, which is in blue or green, is a target audience for squash 57. Squash 57 is a lifetime sport, and we see it as the fun-loving close cousin of squash. I'll assume that Dave has not been able to sign in, so we're now going to hand it.
Dave's back.
Oh, Dave, over to you.
Sorry, first of all, everyone, my apologies. We did a dry run yesterday and everything was working perfectly on my computer. And for some reason, as soon as that quiz came up, it all died. So my humble apologies. Patrick, I did catch you taking over my role there. Thank you so much. So we're leading into Pete now, yeah?
Sorry, yes, Dave, we can move on to Pete, so slide 11, yeah.
Okay, so right, so Dan, Jeff, have you moved on to the next slide? And we're leaving on to Pete now. Now, Pete's got 3 heads here, 3 hats. He's an elite player, he's a club player, and he's a club manager, so he's got a lot of great stuff to talk about. Over to you, Pete. What's going on?
Pete, can you hear us? Dave, Patrick, do you want to pick up for Pete? As I guess he's having technical difficulties.
Yeah, I'm happy to plow on. I'm assuming that I will, because Dave, you sound like you might still have a screen problem. So let me plow on. So at the beginning, we had the 5 questions, and you can see we have these on the grid here. So we have the revenues, diversity, juniors, capacity, doubles, and what Pete's was going to talk to, and I'll talk on his behalf. And fortunately, we have a pretty comprehensive narrative that you on the webinar aren't seeing, so I can do this. I'm going to talk through the points that Pete was going to make about squash 57 and how it hits those challenges that we see in the squash world. So firstly, and as Dave said, Pete has an enormous amount of experience in this space, and I played squash 57 with Pete on teams and in competitions back in the UK before he moved to Canada. So I know he has a lot of very serious background in this sport. So firstly, squash 57, we see squash 57 as easy to start. It's one of the strap lines that we have for squash 57. Oh, and we have Pete back. So Pete, do you want to take over? I can see him on the video here. Pete, do you want to try and talk? You're not, we can't hear you. I can see your lips moving and can't hear you. No? Okay. I'll shake of the head. So I'll continue, Pete. If you sort out your technical difficulties, then interrupt me and please take over. Okay, so squash 57 we see is...
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good Lord. Apologies from England, Dave, and it must be the English connection. Me and Dave are having issues, but it's all good now. Okay, so where was I? Where were we? I started playing some 12 years ago, and it proved to me that this game didn't negatively affect my squash. It actually enhanced it. And it also has the following benefits. It's easy to start for beginners, adults and juniors alike. To pick a racket and start playing immediately is very, very easy, which is one of the big issues with squash. Inclusivity results in a diversity of players. We can get a lot more people playing, and the skill gap is a lot easier to marry up with people. For schools, it's easier for school programs to tap into Squash 57, and it gives us a better chance of getting more juniors on board and retaining those juniors. There's no additional court markings required, as it's played on the same court as single squash. And also, the equipment is relatively inexpensive, and it generally lasts a lot longer than a squash racket, even though you have the same walls and things to deal with. They seem to be far more robust, so you don't actually have to fork out a lot of money for this equipment, and less often. It's great fun to play. I actually find I have more fun playing Squash 57 than I do squash a lot of the time. It's a very strategic game, and it bridges all the skill gaps. We often find that a lot of our club players who are better at squash can play far more fun and competitive games with lesser level players in their club, because it's the ball's harder to kill and the rally's go on for longer. So it encompasses a lot more people playing, and it gives you a lot more people to choose from the same playing pot. As we saw in the introduction video, we've got world champions like Nick Matthew and Peter Nicol having competitive doubles matches with club level players. That's a good indication of what it can do. It can generate a big pool of enthusiastic, fun-loving players from the ground up very quickly. And clubs will significantly notice an increased number of people coming through their doors because it's such a diverse sport. And it can increase in midweek off-peak court usage, as well as doubling the number of ladders and leagues. For events, Squash 57 events for all levels, from club player through to provincial and up to national competitions, have been experienced in England, and the growth in England was, before I came over to Canada 7 years ago, it was a booming sport. And as far as I'm aware, talking with Patrick, it's only gone on to bigger and better things. It's a very hard game to stop as well. The rallies are typically aerobic, strategic, and therefore easier on the joints. And I've certainly found it complements my squash perfectly. Being a close cousin of squash, it keeps the feelings of squash alive for those that have had to stop playing previously due to injury or feeling like they're just getting old. And that's not necessarily the main barrier, but is one of the things that stops people playing squash sometimes. Thus can give us a new lease of life and extend on-court time for people literally by decades. And also, there are several people who've come back to the squash court who've had game sort of stopping injuries, and Dave Morris is a test to that. He's had several knee operations, and he's now playing Squash 57 because his body allows him to. It teaches patience, resilience, rally building. The game of doubles is also fabulously entertaining and engaging. The sport as a whole can improve your footwork because the rallies are generally longer, and it further ingrains movement patterns as long as they're done correctly in the first place. There are way more benefits than we've listed, but this just gives you a flavour of what it can do for clubs, players, coaches, and our sport as a whole, and covers off most of all of the questions from the slide that we showed earlier and the questions that were asked. So that's my part about Squash 57. So I'll hand back to Dave, and he can move you on.
Thanks, Pete. Very interesting. Yeah, I'll agree with him on that one. Squash 57 has most definitely prolonged my career. The only way I could describe it to you guys is, honestly, I feel like I'm playing the way I used to play squash 20 years ago, now with the racquetball, but it's a lot slower, so it's beautiful. Right, I'm going to hand over to Lolly now. What I would have said if I'd been online at the time was Lolly's very much been the glue of this. She's brought us all together, brought this team together, and done so much work on this. So Lolly, thank you for that. And I'm going to hand over to you. She's Secretary General of the Pan American Squash Federation. She's Squash Canada's international delegate and now a member of the WSF Squash 57 Commission. Over to you, Lolly.
Thank you, David, and I'm glad you made it. Before I start, I would like to briefly explain how I got hooked on Squash 57. 3 years ago, founder Eric Hart and I started Canada's first ever program teaching squash to individuals with mental, physical, and emotional disabilities. It's called the Canadian Inclusivity Squash Program. Since that time, I've been obsessed with trying to find easier ways to teach these kids how to play squash and how to make it more fun. Well, after meeting Patrick Osborne last year and learning more about Squash 57, I began getting very excited. But what better way to validate my thoughts than to reach out to my friend Peter Nicol, former world #1. And as you can see on the screen, this was his response to my email. I first want to say that I admire your relentless passion to bringing additional resources to those who are limited in some way, especially to children. By bringing Squash 57 to their lives, they will benefit greatly from physical exercise, which leads to friendship and overall well-being. It makes so much sense to promote this type of game, and I hope you are successful bringing it to Canada. Peter Nicol. Well, sadly, there's been now a deep global concern, including throughout Pan America, that up to 15% of squash courts around the world may not be able to reopen, or they may have to be repurposed as a result of COVID. We need to act now. We really do. Now, we all know that team sports have always been popular in Canada: football, hockey, soccer, baseball, but most recently, pickleball has exploded. Since its inception back in 1960 by a few American men fooling around a golf, in the last 2 years, pickleball has become the fastest growing sport in the world. Well, why? Because it's low impact way to get great exercise and it's fun. Recent statistics also claim pickleball doubles is the most popular version. Why? Because the rallies are longer, there's more social interaction, and because it demands lower physical effort. Yes, pickleball is yelling to the world loud and clear that the masses want to participate in a fun, sociable, easy on the body, and easy to learn sport. Well, as Pete has just told us, Squash 57 can offer all of this too. It's easy to pick up for beginners, it's not demanding on the body, and it's strategically addictive for the seasoned player. Plus, it's played on a 21 by 32 foot international squash court, which is approximately half the size of a pickleball court. We all know facility owners are always trying to find ways to increase revenue and to maximize court usage. More importantly, right now, there's going to be how to attract new members, how to get the existing members back on court, and then how to keep them all on court longer. By bringing Squash 57, every singles court in Canada instantly offers players 3 different versions of squash to play. And this juicy marketing carrot came with 0 capital investment. Now let's take a look at the impact of Squash 57 doubles would have on Canada. Can you go to the next slide, please, Jeff? So here's a picture of the softball doubles courts in Canada. So softball doubles is the version that's played on the 27 by 32 foot court that you see in the Pan Am Games, Commonwealth Games, and World Doubles. But as you can see, there are only 3 clubs in Canada that have these courts. Next slide, please. Okay, hardball doubles. Well, Canada boasts some of the best hardball doubles players in Pan America. It's extremely popular both competitively and recreationally, but there are only 37 clubs in Canada that offer hardball doubles. Okay, is everybody chewing their fingernails now? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Over 95% of the squash courts in Canada are singles courts. Now knowing that Squash 57 doubles is played on the exact same court as Squash 57 singles, which is played on the exact same court as international softball singles, over 1,000 courts in Canada, and that's not including hotels, private homes, non-member clubs. So think of it, can instantly offer every player a WSF sanctioned game of doubles, Squash 57 doubles. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, Squash 57 is a real game changer. The value proposition of a squash membership has more than doubled without the facility spending a dime. As we saw back on the slide in the questionnaire, 95% of you said that you would know or would like to try doubles. Embracing Squash 57 will not only help grow the sport of squash in Canada and in Pan America, it's going to help make it more inclusive sport. It's going to make it more attractive to new and different audiences, and it's going to keep those who love to play on the court for many, many years to come. I sincerely hope everyone is as excited as I am to try Squash 57, and thank you so much for your attention today. Dave, back to you.
Thank you very much, Lolly. That was awesome. So just to pull all this together now, we want to see where Canada stands, Squash Canada, and this is why we're delighted that we've got Steve Wren with us. So Steve, I'm going to pass over to you now to let us know what's happening with Squash Canada and this beautiful game of Squash 57.
G'day, Dave, and everyone out there. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be amongst this esteemed panel. I'm the guy who hasn't played this game, but I've heard a lot about it. And in my role as President of Squash Canada, I think we have a responsibility to explore what can be developed with this game within the confines of our own sport at the moment. What I'd like to talk about is where Squash 57 fits into the anticipation of our sport in the future, and how Squash Canada can assist this in the club's development and player participation. For instance, return to play strategy is something that we're being asked by our membership group, the provinces, territories across the country, to get heavily engaged with them in bringing members back to the clubs. Not only that, but bringing new people into the game as well. And it's been a long time since we've had that type of emphasis needed for our sport. We see Squash 57 as being one of those opportunities to be able to help us interest people with putting a racket in their hand in whatever format that it may be in order to play on our squash courts. I see this being a part of our ongoing communications with the PTs. We're entering into our next quadrennial for strategic planning, and Squash 57 has now wedged itself firmly into our considerations of what we need to do to be able to ensure that participation grows. How do I see it at club level? Well, diversification of a club's programs is obviously an interesting opportunity for members. I can see in a squash club how you've got your squash programming going on in one section and your Squash 57 taking place in another section, and they can speak to both types of members, both types of player. Doubles play, as you can see, facilities without doubles courts means a lot to us. That 4 people onto a court and court utilization starts increasing. We love that one. What about introduction for children, novices, adults, restricted mobility and unmobility, and of course inclusivity for the less fortunate, mentally, physically challenged, who we'd also love to see playing our game. And that's already started in pockets across the country, and thumbs up to those groups who have been able to achieve this. Squash 57 is now a new angle for them to approach, for those participants to have some success with ball on string. I also see, where do we fit Squash 57 in with our national championships? I get questioned this type of thing. Well, I don't want to make promises at this point, but there's certainly room for us to be able to present Squash 57 as a demonstration. And we know what that means, not necessarily a serious event, but certainly one which can promote what the activity looks like, feels like, sounds like, and talk to people who are actually playing it, give people an opportunity. I think of the legends of our game here in Canada. I mean, some of our best players who may come back to our nationals and grace the courts for us to be able to see them play. You could imagine, I'm going to drop a few names here, a Jean Turk and a Melanie Jans playing against Sam Cornette and Jonathan Power. I mean, that would be a delicious opportunity to see what happens with this game. So we'd love to see that type of thing take place, and look out for that one in the future. Anticipating Squash 57 into Squash Canada's mission, well, there's an awareness obviously now. We want to build on what we can provide to people who need more information. So equipment supplier relationships would be important to us, to those interested in the opportunity of which we don't have relationships with now. Educational resources, a part of our strategy with our PTs is to help out with resources. So we will be bringing information of this type of sport and game in a easy to reach manner through our website, with a variety of different links for people to go to be able to see and read more about this and get ideas for your own programming. It's a bottoms-up growth approach. So this really speaks to the participation aspect, obviously. And as we continue in communications with our PT members, we'll follow along with their level of engagement and see how we can help as we learn more about this game within our own game of squash. That would be enough from me with what Squash Canada wishes to do. My dog, who's just come out from under my feet, now wants to leave the room. She obviously didn't like what I had to say, but I'll leave it with you. Thank you, Dave, and thank you to the panel, and thank you for all of your interest to join us here in Canada for this webinar.
Thanks, Steve. Jeff, could you put on the next slide? Yeah, so you'll see here that we put some online resources for you. Basically, there's so much stuff there for you to know more about this game. One thing that's not on there right now, but I want you to be aware of, is the three main players in England right now for racquetball, for squash 57 equipment, is probably Caracal, Head and Dunlop, and I believe we have representatives of all three here today. So they do have this equipment in stock, and you can get hold of them directly. You know, as Pete said earlier, it's not terribly expensive, you know, and the equipment does last a long time. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pass back to Patrick, who's got some closing remarks. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Dave. So from a closing remark standpoint, I wanted to say that Squash 57 has been around a while now. It's been around maybe 45 years, and it's played in 20 to 40 countries. And that's a little vague because sometimes these questionnaires are misinterpreted, but we see very active communities in 20 countries, and 40 countries claim that they play it at the moment. But now is really a very exciting time for Squash 57. As I say, it's been around for 45 years, but things are changing. With the pandemic, that's changed the outlook. And we have Zena Wooldridge now, who's the new president of the World Squash Federation, and she is a Squash 57 player. So there is an increased focus in the world of squash on Squash 57. They're looking at inclusivity. They want to look at fun, and that is really where Squash 57 hits the mark. Before the pandemic hit, England had shown what could be done with Squash 57. So 2019 was a real bumper year in England, and we're lining up for, even though it's going to be a late year this year, we're lining up for something similar this year. In England, nearly every squash club will have Squash 57 in their name in one way or another. So it's no longer Berkhamsted Squash Club, it's Berkhamsted Squash and Squash 57 Club. There's a lot of quantifiable evidence that including Squash 57 will significantly increase your social court bookings with no effort, right? There's no court changes required, the lines are the same, there's no incremental cost for the club. And doing like analysis at the club that I play at, there is clear, unambiguous evidence that the increase in court bookings is about 30%. So that 30% of the court bookings are people who are playing Squash 57 only. They don't play a mix of Squash 57 and squash. These are people who are just playing Squash 57, and that has increased the court bookings by 30% alone. England has a fun, inclusive Squash 57 competition schedule or calendar, right from the club level all the way up to the nationals. We're playing Squash 57 singles and doubles. And in fact, this year, it was announced last week, we're going to include, we're going to have our nationals again in August, and we're going to have a British Open in October. So that's the first time we've had an open event. It was planned for last year, but couldn't take place. And in the nationals, we're planning to include wheelchair events as well. So that is something that will be new to what's going on in the England Squash 57. This webinar has had a superb attendance, and if you look at the map here, we can see where or which Canadian cities are actually attending this webinar today. And there's clearly a huge opportunity here for Squash in Canada to launch Squash 57 across the whole of Canada, across the whole nation from coast to coast. And I assure you that the eyes of the squash world are certainly watching and are very excited by what's taking place here. So a huge thank you to Lolly on triggering all of this, and a huge thank you for Squash Canada and Dave for allowing us to participate in this webinar that was being arranged anyway. And I strongly encourage you to run with this golden opportunity. Say people will be watching, and I have a call later this week with Zena Wooldridge, as I say, who's the president, and the CEO as well, William. We're going to be talking Squash 57 the day after tomorrow off the back of this. So on behalf of the World Squash Federation and the Squash 57 Commission, we want to wish you the greatest success. And thank you very much for allowing us to speak with you today.
Thanks, Patrick. Jeff, I believe we've got some questions and answers now, aren't they? So I think you're going to take care of this, aren't you, and explain to people what they need to do and how they can get their questions over, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for your wonderful presentation. And yeah, we've got some time for questions. So this one here, maybe I'll turn it over to Patrick for the first question here. Just to kind of further elaborate, first question. So why is it called Squash 57?
Okay, so the squash ball here is a 40mm ball, and the powers that be in 2016 wanted to rebrand UK Racketball because Racketball would not be a good global brand because there are many versions of racquetball. There's the American racquetball game, there's an Australian racquetball game, and we had the UK racquetball game. I don't know if you can see that, it's on my hoodie here. They wanted a name, and so they called it Squash 57 because the ball is 57mm in diameter as opposed to the 40mm squash ball, and that's the reason.
Perfect. Thank you, Patrick. And actually, I'll get you to answer this next one as well, since you're talking about the ball specifically. Jeremy Frank asks, which ball do most people use, the black or the blue?
Okay, and that is a great question. So we have the two balls, the black and the blue, and the black is not as bouncy as the blue ball, and it's a personal preference. So they've been basically called less bouncy and more bouncy, and it's up to you which one you would like to use. Now, the one that is used the most will be the black ball. There are pockets of communities who like to use the blue ball, and an example of that will be Malaysia. So in Malaysia, which is a big Squash 57 playing community, they use the blue ball, and the reason they use the blue ball is because they wanted Squash 57 in their country to be as far removed from squash as they could make it. They obviously love squash, but they wanted a very different game, so they used the blue ball. But in the UK, I would say that 95% use the black ball, and probably that's there's a longer answer there, so I'm going to stick with the shorter answer. And I did see there was a question come through, so let me just continue rambling a bit. There was a question about altitude. Altitude doesn't make a huge difference to these Squash 57 balls, and I can say that because I played in there's a tournament in Albuquerque that takes place every year. It's the American Racquetball Seniors World Masters or whatever, and they have since 2018 included a Squash 57 competition, and that's at 6,000 feet, and it made no difference for as far as these balls was concerned. I couldn't tell the difference, and what will make a difference is how humid it may be or how hot your court is. But really, the black ball will bounce like a black ball, whether it's at sea level or at 6,000 feet.
Great, thanks, Patrick. Next question comes to us from Dave Howard, and I'm not sure if any of our panel has the answer to this, but Dave, what I can say to your question, that is, can Club Locker handle using the same criteria court information that you have for singles and doubles squash for Squash 57? I'm not sure if any of our panel have an answer to that question, but if not, we will speak to Club Locker and get you an answer on that question.
So Jeffrey, it's Lolly here. I was speaking with Kim Clerkin, and US Squash and Club Locker are working on specific programming right now for Squash 57. How advanced they are, I do not know, but it is on their radar.
Perfect. Thank you, Lolly. So next question comes to us from Robert Dubé. Are the rackets similar to racquetball like we know it? There doesn't seem to be any specific Squash 57 rackets available in Canada.
So let me answer that one. So the official specifications for Squash 57 rackets is pretty much identical to American racquetball rackets, which is pretty much identical to Australian racquetball rackets. And we have been collaborating with those three sports, been collaborating to make sure that the rackets do not diverge in their specifications. So if you are using an American racquetball racket, that is the same as a Squash 57 racket. So Caracal on their frame will say Squash 57, and they are pretty unique in having done that. And that may be because they are a UK company who are supporting the Squash 57 community, and you won't see their rackets in the American racquetball world, right? But the racket is the same. So you can buy an American racquetball racket and it'll be the same as and it'll meet the specification of a Squash 57 racket.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Next question comes to us from Aaron Rodriguez. What's the average cost for the rackets in the balls?
I'll try that from a UK standpoint. So the balls are no different in cost to a squash ball. So and you can translate that into Canadian money if you like, but they're the same. From a racket standpoint, behind me I have a very nice racket on the wall there, actually Squash and Squash 57, and that very nice Squash 57 racket is cheaper than a squash racket. And I would say that most of our Squash 57 rackets are probably 30% to maybe more cheaper than squash rackets. So this game is definitely cheaper. And as Pete and I think Dave has said, they last a lot longer. So I don't know, we can make a number up, but how long does a squash ball last? You could probably play with a squash ball without worrying about it for 3 hours. Maybe, and then it's going to be a little bit shiny. It's going to be flying off the walls a bit odd. You can play with a Squash 57 ball for a month. It will go a little bit shiny, and the manufacturers will say that once the logo has come off the ball, then it's no longer sort of guaranteed to be a great ball. But they continue playing perfectly adequately until they burst, which is not the case for a squash ball. So the balls, even though they cost about the same to buy, they work out a lot cheaper for Squash 57. For the rackets, because they are shorter frame, you're going to get less speed on the racket head. If you're hitting the wall accidentally, there's less impact on that, less damage done to your racket. I haven't broken a Squash 57 racket for a long time. They don't break. Squash, they do break, but nothing like they used to when they were wooden, though.
Perfect. Thank you, Patrick. Next question, Patrick, if you want to answer this one as well, just some clarification around the Squash 57 ball. Is it the same diameter as a racquetball ball? Yes, it is. It's the same diameter, but very, very different. So the bounce on an Australian racquetball ball is about the same as the blue ball, so it's quite lively.
the American racquetball ball, and I know there are variations on that, and actually the IRF are trying to slow down their balls because to make the game more interesting to the audience, because the audience can't keep up with their regular balls, are much more lively than our blue ball. So it might look the same, but don't buy it for your squash court because it'll fly around like a super ball, and you'll regret it.
Great, thank you. Next question, this one probably best for Lolly, because I know you were talking to Kim at US Squash. Dennis Bishop asks, are the Americans playing Squash 57? Maybe you want to elaborate a little bit, Lolly, in your chat with Kim?
I think there's several coaches from the US on this webinar too that could answer better than I can, and also Patrick, because he's played events in the US, and as he said, in Albuquerque, so Albuquerque obviously has a contingency. Patrick, do you want to, I know Florida where Tim has some people playing. Pat, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, there are definitely pockets, and I think there is a Facebook group that is tracking which states are now playing or have active Squash 57 communities, and I think it's something like 20 states are now. But there is now a contact point and Squash 57 activity taking place. So it's not mature there, but it's certainly picking up interest.
Great, thanks, Patrick and Lolly. Okay, so another question. I think in the interest of time, we will make this the last two questions that have just come in for the day. So the first one is from Naresh, who's from Mayfair Parkway and Markham. What did you find to be the best way to introduce Squash 57 to members in the club, especially if it's new to the region?
I don't mind taking this one for how we did it in Windsor.
Okay, go ahead, Dave.
Okay, so basically, so I arrived in Windsor 2016, and Graham Williams was also there, and he was also a very accomplished Squash 57 player. So him and I, basically, this is no joke, we would just play a couple of times a week at lunchtime, and people saw how much fun we were having. Honestly, and it kind of grew from there, and then we got a lunchtime league going. We had 16 players on our noon league. So really, it's about, I personally feel one of the things is getting a couple of keen people playing at times where members can see, because they'll just see the passion and the joy that is being exuded there. Patrick, over to you.
Yeah, I think there are a few ways of doing this, and it might depend on whether you're looking to attract new members into your club, or whether you are looking to engage the existing squash players and get them to figure out the game. But what we've found, and with a lot of the competitions that we run, is we can run a full day competition with players playing multiple times during the day, and you don't have the same challenges physically in doing that. So a recommendation I would have is, you will have probably a squash competition that takes maybe a week, maybe 3 weeks to run the course of the competition. You can run a competition on a day, and you could possibly seed it with rackets and balls and say, come and try and join the competition. It's a day's investment from your existing squash players. Another example of how this can be done is in Belgium. So Belgium have seeded all of their or not all of their clubs. So Belgium, there's two halves to Belgium. So they've taken half of Belgium, 40 clubs, and they've given them all base level equipment and balls and said, here, go play, and we're going to have leagues and ladders and whatever else. And they're hoping that by seeding and investing, and it's not a huge investment, right, because the equipment's not that expensive, by seeding those clubs, that they will then drive or kickstart the sport in Belgium. So there are many different ways. And if you need help or ideas around that, we do have some like A3 posters that give ideas on how to try and find target audiences if you're looking outside of your club, to encourage more people to see the fun and the inclusivity of Squash 57 and get them into your club.
Great, thanks, gentlemen. One other quick question just came in here before we get to the final question. Bob Ballinger asks, for the average level of player, can a match be finished in 45 minutes with longer rallies involved? Patrick, I'm not sure if you want to take that one.
That's a brilliant question. So the club that I play at, we have 1 hour sessions, and we can fit it into 1 hour. For the competitions that get run, so the regional competitions in the UK, they will play best of 3, and because you're playing multiple times a day, best of 3, and you will get your game finished within the half an hour. So based on that, you know, if you're talking a 10-minute game, you may need 50 minutes if you're going to get 5 games, right? But it's a great question. But you know, on the flip side of that, you're going to spend less time walking around picking the ball up, right? You're getting your aerobic rallies, and you know, if you're 45 minutes, maybe you're hitting the ball for 30 of those as opposed to only 15.
Great, thanks, Patrick. Last question. I'm going to direct this one to our President Steve Wren and or our Squash Canada Executive Director Dan Wolfenden, who is also on the call. Question is, would Squash Canada assist clubs in getting equipment for trial of Squash 57 before players make investments in the equipment? Steve or Dan?
Well, Dan, maybe I'll start and then you can whip me afterwards regarding what I might be saying here. But that's a great question, and we got somewhat of an answer from Patrick there with what's happening in Belgium. That's really interesting. We've got a lot more to learn about that if we were to get into some sort of equipment provision scenario. But as I mentioned earlier, our relationships with equipment suppliers would be very important as well. So, you know, if something like this was to eventuate, spreading the cost across the bases could be one way to look at it. We've also got to be careful about just how monies are spent. Most of you will know we remain a government-funded organisation, so where monies are spent with respect to investment back into the sport, there could be additional funding for that type of thing. But I think a good question, because you've probably given us about half a day of chatting to have within the Squash Canada board, and that is a really interesting one. Keep your eyes on this. Thank you. Dan.
I suppose if we heard from the community that having equipment is the barrier to participation, we'd need to look at that. As a national association with a geography our size and the number of clubs that we have around the country, I can see the administration of having Squash 57 kits on loan out around the country to be a little bit cumbersome, a little clunky. But perhaps again, if there is a demand, and maybe we can work with some of the suppliers who would have a vested interest as well to get gear into the hands of participants around the country, that we could look at it. But I think, as we're hearing from the presenters today, the equipment is not terribly expensive, and perhaps with a small investment, a club could get started with 2 rackets to have those kind of demos that Dave Morris was talking about.
Great, thanks, Steve, and thank you, Dan. So with that being said, I would like to, on behalf of Squash Canada and our presenters, first off, thank Dave, Patrick, Pete, Steve, and Lolly for your fantastic presentation today. It was a very informative presentation and a lot of great questions from the group in attendance. Just a friendly reminder to all of those you are on the call still, we have a Squash Canada Coach PD webinar coming up on April 20th, presented by Eric Baldwin. It is called Doubling Down on Double Squash. So it will talk to you about how to create double squash programming within your club, or to improve your programming within your club and increase your double squash presence within your community. So register for that. That webinar is also free. And then we will have more webinars coming up in May and June related to athlete development, coach PD, and officiating. So we encourage you to stay tuned for more Squash Canada webinars as we roll them out. Otherwise, thank you again, everyone, for attending today. The webinar recording and PowerPoint slides will be available within 24 hours by email and on our website. Thank you again, everyone.